This year, I participated in the GMTK Game Jam, which challenges game developers to create a full game in 50 hours according to a certain theme. It was an intense weekend with many ups and downs, but I managed to complete the challenge and I published my game to itch, the website that hosted the jam. This year's jam theme was Roll of the Dice, and because there were no restrictions on game engine, I opened up Unity, the engine which I have the most experience with, and I created a new project called Zolkin Rebellion. I have no idea why I named the project this, but I did, and at the time I thought it sounded cool, so I went with it. With the project opened, I began to think of ideas to do with dice, chance, and gambling. I thought of Cuphead and its secondary antagonist, King Dice, which made me think of jazz, which made me think of Cowboy Bebop, which then made me think of the two categories of sci-fi that I recognize: the slick white walls of highly organized spaceships, and the dysfunctional, gritty, and messy world of cyberpunk. Yeah, welcome to my head. I went from Cuphead to cyberpunk in a couple of minutes. It's a complete mess. But anyways, I thought about making a 2D platformer in the same vein as Hollow Knight, but with completely different movement mechanics and a ranged fighting style. The game would be themed as two sci-fi worlds clashing. The story in my head went something like this. The main character starts off in a slick sci-fi world with a clean, white and hologram blue color scheme. But everything from having the ability to smell to looking at the sky would be a microtransaction. You wouldn't even own your own body. Every day people would pay to use it. This puts the main character under a lot of stress, which eventually leads to them having a mental breakdown, where they decide to stop paying for every little thing and they join a rebellion group whose hideout is outside of the big city, and so it's super gritty. The police track the rebel group because the player joined them. The player then fights off the police as the rebels, and the player run away, trying to live another day. The game would end with the player and the rebels just barely escaping as they establish a new hideout and plan their next moves. I chose this type of ending because it gives some closure without making the player a god among men who managed to destroy an entire authoritarian regime in a couple of minutes of gameplay. As you can tell, this was a bit ambitious, and I didn't really know how far I would get, but when you believe in yourself, you can do incredible things. So I hunkered down and I began to work. I got about 3.5 hours into the project, until I realized it was practically impossible for me to do solo, especially because my art skills are, well, lacking to say the least. And plus, I had no idea how to do a 2D platformer with ranged combat. You would think I would be disheartened at this point, but thanks to my squirrel brain, I wasn't. Because at the same time I had this realization, I also got a new idea for a game. With randomness much more at the core of the experience. Something that was fairly unique, and something which I thought was more interesting. On the lower side of the screen, the player would have a couple of dice with random values from 1 to 6. To the right of the player's screen are a bunch of abilities that the player can use: move, jump, attack, etc. These abilities would use the dice's values in different ways. The jump, for example, could move the player half the amount shown on the dice upwards and half in the forward direction. The world would also be turn-based. For the player to go to the next turn, they would have to use all their dice. This idea seemed cool in my head, and it looked like it would be mechanically interesting with a number of strategies the player could use to get to the end. And because it had a good bit of randomness, it may have some replayability. With the plan set, I got to work writing code. The way I set up the system is by having the panels on the right call a method whenever a dice is dropped in them, which reads the value of the dice and sends that along with the ability ID to the Game Manager class, which controls everything from the player's movements to the enemy's moves and attacks. But here is where I made the single most moronic decision of the entire jam. This is the thing I regret most about how I made my game, even above wasting 3 hours and a half on an overambitious game idea, or not adding animations. The way I set up my game to handle the detection of ground and walls, basically the thing that makes sure players can't just walk through walls and jump in midair, works like this. Everything that moves has a script attached with a really basic method, which does a raycast in a direction and a distance specified, and returns an array of all raycast hit 2Ds. this system works well for my game, since this way my manager class can easily call a method to get information on whether or not an enemy or a player should be able to move, and then it can act accordingly. Or at least that's the line of thinking. But for some god-forsaken reason, instead of handling the returned raycast hit to the array in a for loop, or in a for each loop, looking at each item hit and seeing what tag is associated with that box collider, like a sane person, I thought that it would take too much time, and a similar result can be had by just looking at the length of the array and seeing whether or not that lines up with the expected values. So if I wanted to check if the player is standing on ground, I could call the script which handles the raycasting on my player's game object and do a raycast downwards with a distance of something like 1. And if the raycast hit to the array had a length of 2, 1 hit for the player's own collider and 1 for the ground's, then I would know the player standing on the ground. Spoiler, this doesn't work. This is such a bad idea. It caused so many bugs. It feels like a quarter of the game's development was just spent fixing this stupidly flawed system. But no, it would take too long to write a simple for each loop with a conditional asking whether or not any of the raycast hit to these belong to an object with a ground tag or something. In the end, 3 hours before the game jam finished, I updated my game to use the for each loop method, and I spent about half an hour switching over and debugging it, and it works infinitely more than the old method. I spent half an hour on switching it over to this for each loop idea, and it just works. I debugged it a little bit, there were some small bugs, but it's so much better. Viewers with eyes may notice that the visually stunning gameplay that I'm showing doesn't have any enemies. And that's because halfway through development, I felt like the game was kind of split between combat and movement. I think that it was way too cluttered, and I felt the game would be better if I didn't include combat, and fully committed to making the game about player versus environment. So the enemies turned into static spikes that you would die on if you ended your turn above them, and therefore fell onto them. The last major thing that I wanted to say about gameplay and the code is about the UI. I had very little experience when it came to UI before this. In all my previous games, I had at most some buttons and text that updated to show high scores and also some health bars. It was a bit daunting to make a project where a major part of the game, the dice and the abilities, were tied to a system UI that I didn't know well, but I knew that I could get over it with some help from YouTube. Luckily, the algorithm gods were on my side, and in a single search, I found an excellent video by CodeMonkey. It was a tutorial that was for a drag-and-drop inventory system, link in the description. This was basically identical to my use case, and I followed along, and in 20 minutes I had a dice that you could drag, and slots that you could put those dice in. I also made it so that if you brought the dice outside the valid area, the dice would be teleported back to the last position that was valid. This worked great until it didn't, and when I made my ability slots more organized by parenting everything properly, I tried to drop my dice in the ability slots, and it didn't work. The dice was, for some reason, being snapped near the middle of the screen instead of the ability slot. This started a multi-hour session of me going on forums and reading documentation to figure out how to fix this. This literally gave me a headache, but eventually after much trial and tribulation I managed to get it to work. The dice finally snapped to the middle of the slot. Here's the code. It's awful, I know. That's pretty much all I wanted to say about the programming side of things, but games aren't just code, you also need graphics, music, and a bunch of other things. So about halfway through the jam, I took a break from programming to focus on the art. I used Krita. I don't know if that's the proper way to pronounce it. It's just fun to say Krita. It sounds like I'm a Hollow Knight character. It's fun. It's very fun. Krita is a free art program which I like to use to make pixel art. With it, I made a pretty generic looking ground tile set and a couple of other tile sets too. However, I only used the ground tile set, so I wasted some time here. I also made a Spike and the main character's sprite too. I had no idea what the main character should look like, so I spent literally 2 minutes drawing a weird person with Shanghai noodles for arms and legs, and I thought it looked weird, but still readable as human, or as generically humanoid, so I kept it. I also used Krita to make all the UI elements for my game, especially the abilities and ability slots, and the dice table thing at the bottom of the screen. This pretty much concludes all of the graphics I made for the game. Now onto the audio component. For the music I used LMMS, a free music making software. I wrote a super simple song in about an hour, with the beat being handled by a sample of a bass slap. I made it play a quarter note at C on beats 1 and 3 for pretty much the entire song, except for the last 2 bars before the song loops. There, the bass slap does a quarter note on beat 1 and 2 eighth notes, one on beat 3 and one on the and of 3. The melody is in the key of C major in 4/4 time signature. I know, it's a very original starting point. Here's how it sounds. I think it works for what it's supposed to do. It's not too complicated and won't distract the player, while giving them something to listen to while they decide their next move. I also added some violin to the song to give it a happy, spontaneous feel. I particularly like how the violin always goes from a low note to a high note, except for the end where it goes from a high note to the root note of C. Then the bass line continues on for a few bars after the song ends, or after the main melody ends, and then the song loops over and over again. Another small adjustment that I made to the song is that I made the first few notes of the melody quieter, since it was a little startling to have the melody go at full volume after the bass looped. After this, I added a bit of reverb to make it sound a bit more spacious, and to make the samples sound a bit better. Overall, I'm happy with the way the song ended up. It's small, it's simple, but I think that it's good for this. I'm sure that in a couple of weeks, though, I'll look back at it and cringe, but hey, that's the case with everything I create, so nothing new here. One last note about the song. After the game jam finished, I tried to write the song down in standard music notation as a fun little exercise for me, since I want to get better at it. Here's what I got. Note that I don't do this often, and so there's probably a lot of mistakes and quirks. If you see any, please tell me if you see anything off, or incorrect. I didn't write the bass part properly, same with the violin, since I wanted to fit it on one page, and the treble clef looks like it has a vitamin deficiency. But I think the melody is kind of readable, if not unpolished looking, so at least that. Back to the jam experience. My game was sadly suffering from an awful disease known as no feedbackitis. There are multiple treatments for this disease, such as animation and sound effects, but animation would be pretty much impossible for me to do in the amount of time I had left, so that only left sound effects. I used my mic, OBS, and Audacity to record and modify some noises I made. The walk sound effect is me tapping my fingers on the table really loudly. The dash is making me a whoosh sound. The jump effect is me doing a boing sound. Boing. I also added a fail to do anything sound effect, which is me doing a sound. I also added a deaf sound, which is just me straining my vocal cords, sounding like a goat dying or something. And I also added a trumpet fanfare sound if you get to the end of the game. This was also made with LMMS, and it's really basic. I tried to balance the audio the best I could in the game, but I feel like I should have spent more time with it. The dash is a bit loud. Oh, and by the way, here are some mistakes that made it into the final build of the game. Here near the end of the game, I used the wrong grass tile. Also, I didn't extend some walls far enough so you can actually see into the void that's past them. And lastly, there's a weird glitch in a specific part of the map which for some reason doesn't allow you to move. I have no idea why this happens. Thank you to the one person who will watch this video. Leave a comment if you have any ideas about the game or the song or the graphics or anything really. The Code Monkey video is again linked in the description, and thank you for your time. Goodbye.